Hi everyone and welcome to the Wrongfully Heard podcast. This is the Wrongfully Heard podcast.
And wrongfully convicted.
In this case, nobody got justice.
Was wrongly convicted of a miscarriage of justice. Azaria found new scientific evidence proving her innocence.
Hi, my name is Kaylee and I'm so excited for you to be joining this podcast today. It is going to be a good one. It might be a bit of a long one, so grab a drink, grab a snack, sit back and relax. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone, not only for joining today, but looking at my TikTok, following, commenting, liking, and also on my YouTube and my Spotify. The love in the last week has been absolutely crazy, and I just want to say thank you for everyone for believing in this podcast and enjoying it and watching it, because it's only been up and running for less than a month. So yeah, and I just want to talk a little bit about my new series on TikTok called Trial by TikTok, where we have a bunch of different topics that I will cover. And this week we covered whether you would like a trial by jury or a trial by judge, and I basically present you with all of the information and you guys get to pick, based on your personal opinion, your experiences, which one would you prefer to be tried as. And I just want it to be a respectful debate in the comments, just so we can engage with people, understand and learn a little bit from each other. And yeah, so let me know if you enjoy that and what kind of topics you would like to debate. It has to stay in the criminology, wrongful conviction, different things like that. It can be police, prosecution, it can be anything to do in that realm, but it's got to stay in there. So today we have the Lindy Chamberlain case, as I said before, and there is a bunch of different sections we have to uncover, so I will be putting them up here in timestamps. So if you want to skip to certain sections or just have a clear outline, it will all be up here. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So August 17th, 1980, 9-week-old Azaria Chamberlain went missing from her family's tent. This was in a campsite now called Uluru, which was once called Ayers Rock. I'm not sure if I said that right. So yeah, in Australia. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the events that happened during that day. So the Chamberlains went down to that campsite and were exploring the area that day, including climbing the rock. Lindy noticed that there was some dingoes lurking around the area that evening, and later that evening, Lindy put Azaria to bed. The family was at a communal barbecue around 8 p.m. Dingoes were noted to be scavenging around and being quite aggressive around that area that evening, and so the campers were notified. And so later that evening, Lindy took Azaria to the tent to put her in her bassinet to go to sleep, and a short time later, a bunch of campers heard a very loud, high-pitched cry, and so Lindy emerged back to Azaria's tent and saw a dingo leaving the tent with something in its mouth. Lindy discovered Azaria missing from her bassinet and cried out, "A dingo stole my baby," or "A dingo took my baby," which is one of the most infamous lines in wrongful conviction history. Campers, rangers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander trackers went out in a frantic search to look for Azaria, and no body was found. So the first police officers to come to the scene was Frank Morris, and he noted some blood in the tent and saw dingo paw prints leading its way from the entrance, which those tracks disappeared on a nearby road. Azaria's bloodstained clothing was discovered a week later by a tourist near the base of a rock near a dingo den, but her body was never found. This event sparked Australia's most controversial legal events in history. It wasn't until weeks later when the police's target changed from a wild animal to Azaria Chamberlain's mother, Lindy. So the question between the prosecution and the defense was it a mother's betrayal or was it a unprecedented act of nature? So the prosecution, they didn't find a body, a weapon, a motive, a confession, no direct witness. The prosecution had to build a case from circumstantial evidence. So circumstantial evidence is not direct proof, but it is sort of clues for a jury to infer that something happened. So it is not it's not fact that something happened, but there are facts around that the jury can puzzle together and then lead to a conviction. So the more indirect facts they have, the stronger the case is to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense's position was that it was a dingo attack and that they had eyewitness testimony to back it up. They had physical evidence such as dingo tracks. They had the known danger of dingoes in the area at that time. So now we are going to be deconstructing the prosecution's case in a bit more detail. So here are those pieces of circumstantial evidence that, when put together, has built the prosecution case. So the prosecutors alleged that there was a brief 5 to 10 minute window where Lindy Chamberlain took Azaria from the tent to their car and cut the baby's throat. She then hid the body potentially in one of the camera bags that were in the car and left and disposed of Azaria and composed herself. She returned to the barbecue calm with a can of baked beans for her son Aiden. Fetal blood in the car. So the primary forensic evidence of the prosecution's case was the blood that was in a form of a spray pattern found underneath the car's dashboard. There was rigorous testing, they argued, and it confirmed that there was a presence of fetal hemoglobin, which is a type of blood that's unique to infants, and this finding placed the baby's blood inside the car, directly corroborating the prosecution's story and theory of how the murder happened. So, however, this piece of evidence had some controversy. The defense's scientific experts challenged the reliability of this methodology to identify this type of blood. I believe it was still in the stages of testing and understanding its reliability. It was kind of more of a trial test rather than something that could be used as fact in court. So yeah, it was quite a messy piece of forensic evidence. A staged scene and inconsistent statements. So Azaria's jumpsuit was discovered near a dingo lair a week after her disappearance. Its condition became a central point for the prosecution's argument. So the prosecution testified that because the tear in the jumpsuit was so clean that it had to have been cut by scissors and that it couldn't have been ripped apart by a dingo. So the prosecution urged the jury to draw to the conclusion that it was tampered by a human being. The next point is Lindy's inconsistent statements. So the prosecution highlighted that There was numerous inconsistencies in her statements to the police, to the campers, and coroners between the night of the disappearance and the trial. The key areas were what, if anything, she saw in the dingo's mouth the moment she raised the alarm, and which direction the dingo fled. The argument was that if she was innocent, she wouldn't have all these different stories, and she would have had one consistent story, but if she was guilty, she would have inconsistent statements to conceal a lie. The defense's rebuttal. The defense's strategy was twofold. It sought to dismantle the prosecution's case, and it also was to present an alternative hypothesis. So that was that the dingo did take the baby. So one of the main planks was the baby's cry, and so there was a eyewitness, Miss Lowe, who was a neighboring camper on the site, saying that the baby's cry was coming from the Chamberlain's tent after the prosecution alleged that Lindy had already returned from killing Azaria. The implications of the single piece of evidence were catastrophic for the Crown's case, and a High Court justice stated that if that cry was Azaria's, that the prosecution's case would have been quashed, and that the Chamberlains would have been innocent. So I have a question for you. So with this one piece of evidence, the whole prosecution case has now collapsed. So why didn't the jury agree? Corroborating the dingo hypothesis. So dingoes were a known danger in that area, and park authorities had made that known to all of the campers around. There was physical tracks of dingoes as well. There were multiple independent witnesses, including other campers, and police observed dingo tracks around the Chamberlain's tent immediately after Azaria's appearance. Drag marks. So, Senior Ranger Derek Rolfe observed tracks indicating that an animal had dragged something heavy away from the campsite. These drag marks originated from a point directly across from the Chamberlain's tent. The holes in the murder theory. So there was many theories that the prosecution had claimed to be true, that the defense's evidence had basically quashed in everything that they presented to the jury. So one would be limited opportunity. The 5 to 10 minute window for Lindy Chamberlain to commit this murder was practically impossible. She would have had to murder Azaria, change out of bloodied clothes, hide the body, clean herself, and handle herself and compose herself to a degree that no one would know what she had done. So, and this all would have happened with her 6-year-old son standing right next to her the whole time. Secondly would be the disposal of the body. The court noted that there was a risk in Lindy Chamberlain being able to dispose of Azaria's body because there was such a high presence of people around her tent and in the campsite that there was no way that she could dispose of the body without being caught. And there was an absence of motive. So the court explicitly noted that there was no motive for this murder, and that Lindy Chamberlain was consistently described as a devoted and happy mother. So the verdict. On October 29th, 1982, Lindy was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor, and Michael Chamberlain, which was her husband, was sentenced to 18 months as an accessory. The jury likely made their decision based on the scientific evidence of the fetal hemoglobin blood. High Court Justice Murphy later argued this was a misdirection as the experts raised serious concerns about the testing of the fetal blood, and that once the fetal blood was accepted as fact, it created a presumption of guilt that colored the jury's view of all other ambiguous evidence, such as Lindy's demeanor and her inconsistent statements. Imprisonment. So Lindy Chamberlain was sentenced to a prison in Darwin, and that's where she had her second daughter, Kalia, and she was born in November of 1982. Two appeals followed. The first heard by the federal court in April of 1983. That was rejected. The second was lost in the High Court of Australia in February of 1984, and the Chamberlain Innocence Committee was formed with the aim of building public support for a new inquiry. A couple years later, a crucial piece of evidence had popped up. So a matinee jacket of Azaria's was found near a dingo den. Police were told about this matinee jacket by Lindy Chamberlain, but they did not believe her. They did not believe that this jacket existed because it went against their whole case. And so once they found the jacket, this was 6 years after Azaria was taken, and this was the piece of evidence that exonerated Lindy Chamberlain in February of 1986. So there was a royal commission that was created in 1986 by Trevor Morling to quash the Chamberlain's convictions. However, it still returned as an open verdict despite Morling's finding that the evidence affords considerable support for the view that the dingo may have taken Azaria. Lindy was released from prison in February of 1986. The Chamberlains were exonerated in September of 1988. So that's the whole storyline, and now I'm going to talk about the systemic failures exposed by the Chamberlain case. So, the fallibility of forensic science. This case is a warning that scientific evidence is not infallible. Unverified tests like the hemoglobin test were presented as definitive proof. The High Court itself cautioned that a scientific observation is not taken at face value until several scientists have repeated the observation independently, which was not a principle that was followed here. Actually, after the first few testing of this blood, the sample was thrown away, which never happens. Even years after a case has been finished and tried and everything, that sample stays. Secondly is the danger of tunnel vision. So the investigation demonstrates a classic case of tunnel vision, where police and prosecutors commit to a theory and base all of their evidence and that they find around their theory, and whatever doesn't fit into that theory, they just discard it as unuseful evidence, rather than exploring all of the possibilities. And it is not the prosecution's job to convict someone to be guilty. It is actually the prosecution's job to be a minister of justice. So they're supposed to be the ones who are both on the victim side and the state side, while also being an advocate for the guilty. But it often seems like a prosecution against defense when that shouldn't be the case. And finally is the misuse of expert evidence. So the Morling Commission found that experts testified on the outer margins of their expertise. The case highlights the critical need for judges to act as gatekeepers against junk science and to ensure that the defense has equal access to expert resources. So yeah, that is the end of the content for this podcast. I just want to say thank you for everyone for supporting me so far and being so interested in this case this many years later. It is our duty as the new generation to keep these cases in the media. We need to keep people informed, keep people learning about how the justice system isn't infallible and that it does have cracks that we need to be aware of. And so it's very good to see that there's so many people who are also passionate about this case. I see all your comments. I'm trying to respond to all of them. And yeah, I just hope that you stay around for this journey and we keep talking about cases and keep this out in the media and trying to create awareness about wrongful convictions, because it ruins lives and it ruins families. Lindy Chamberlain has still got so much emotion when talking about this. She still has so much trauma, you see from the documentaries and the interviews that she has. And it wasn't till decades later in 2012 where she actually had Azaria's death certificate changed. So the legal process is such a long process, and it drags out trauma, and it drags out for the victim. In this case, the victim wasn't alive, but when the victim is alive, it just drags it out and creates more stress and trauma and re-victimizes people. And in this case, Lindy was re-victimized with this whole process, and it just shows that in the Australian criminal justice system, as much as they do amazing things for victims and everything, that sometimes the defense isn't always guilty, and we need to remember that, because the defense is a human being too, defending their innocence. When someone goes to court saying that they are innocent, not all the time they will be, but sometimes they are, and we need to hear them out. We can't just assume that they're guilty right from the get-go. Anyway, I digress. Thank you everyone for watching. Stay tuned, because I post fortnightly on my podcast, but I post every day on my TikTok. Follow my TikTok podcast on Spotify, YouTube. Follow my Instagram as well. Thank you everyone, and I will see you next time.